Let's talk Super Nintendo. Hi, friends. Today we're going to go through my Super Nintendo collection. I've got 33 games to go through, but first let's talk about systems and accessories. So, the original Super Nintendo, I actually got this as my third console in college from my roommate who needed cash. Had it ever since. Gotta love the iconic Super Nintendo controller. Must have, of course. I've really been enjoying playing on my 8-bit Do controller though. I have a Bluetooth adapter for it that plugs in my Super Nintendo, and I replaced the joystick with these keypad buttons. As far as testing goes and some casual couch play, I do like to use a Hyperkin Superboy. It takes original cartridges, uses the system on a chip, but very great way to play your original games. If you want to play your Game Boy games on the big screen, you've got the Super Game Boy. And of course, at the start of the video, you saw the Super Scope. Light gun games on this generation weren't crazy good, but still fun nonetheless. So let's jump into those games. We'll start off with Super Mario All-Stars. This game had Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3 and lost levels on it. The 2 being the reskin of, Doki Doki Panic or whatever. And then you've got Lost Levels, which was the second one in Japan. There's also a version of that game that came bundled with Super Mario World, which was a launch title. I have them separate, of course. But this game saw the introduction of Yoshi as a rideable character. Love that. I love my Yoshi games, as you know. They introduced the spin jump. You could store a power-up. There was Star Road. There was the multiple exits to levels. Very, very replayable game. Still very popular to this day. Then you've got the sequel to that game, which isn't really a sequel, but Nintendo likes to do this by name. We've got a custom case here for Yoshi's Island, Super Mario World 2, and you can see how it kind of stores the game in there. But this is my favorite Super Nintendo game. You can watch my favorites YouTube video and check that out. But essentially, you're playing as Yoshi, not as a rideable character, but just as Yoshi, and you're saving baby Mario, getting him back to his parents because he got dropped by a stork, and then of course you've got the plot of going through all the levels, having all the enemies, the bosses, all that kind of fun stuff. I love playing as Yoshi in games because of the floaty platforming. The flutter kicking is very enjoyable to me in a platforming sense. And you also don't have timed levels. I like to explore and take my time and really enjoy the puzzles and collecting everything. So very fun that way. Has a very nice hand-drawn style. You're going through and collecting flowers and red coins and just getting the 100% for each level if you want to. It gives you a score at the end of every level to see what you missed. So you have a lot of replayability there. You also have the ability to transform into vehicles as Yoshi, which is super fun. Whether it's a train or a helicopter or what have you, and you're going through, it's a ton of fun to play through those levels as well. Moving on to the Donkey Kong Country series, you've got first the original Donkey Kong Country. These games were, of course, made by Rare, which they made a lot of great games in this era. You've got the second one, which is Diddy Kong's Quest. And you've got the third one, which is Dixie Kong Double Trouble. So the first one kind of set the tone for the genre. You've got 2D pre-rendered sprites, which look amazing for the generation. And you're going through as Diddy and Donkey Kong trading off. You're riding on animals. You're going in mine carts. You're collecting all kinds of things for more levels. Lots and lots of fun that way. In the second one, Donkey Kong is captured, and you have to play through and capture and save him that way. So you've got Dixie and Diddy in that one, and you're playing through and trying to save Donkey Kong. And then in the third one, similar plot, but this time Diddy Kong and Donkey Kong are captured. Sorry for all the spoilers. And you're playing as Dixie, and I believe Dixie's cousin or sister or something, and you're playing through that way. I think people say that the second one or third one are their favorites. I would say number 2 is my favorite. Playing as Diddy and Dixie is a lot of fun. But in the third one, you can bounce on water. In the third one, you also don't have as linear of an overworld map. So very great games, very enjoyable that way. Moving on to non-first party Nintendo platformers, we've got Plock. Plock is a pretty cool game. You're playing through and you can throw your legs and your arms as weapons, and you can lose them. You can gain them back, but it's just kind of cool that way. It's a very colorful game. Very, very fun game to play through. Next up, we've got Harley's Humongous Adventure. This game is like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, basically. You get shrunk down and you're going through platforming levels, and you're trying to find all the parts to rebuild the machine to get big again. Next up, we got a weird one. Michael Jordan, Chaos in the Windy City. This game is very bizarre. It's not a basketball game. It does have a basketball theme, of course. It's Michael Jordan. As you're running around as your character, you're bouncing a basketball. You're dunking on enemies to damage them. You're finding a lot of keys to get exits, and the whole plot is to go through and save other all-stars who have been captured. Kind of reminds me of a movie that Michael Jordan was in, Space Jam, right? So next up, we've got Cool Spot. Cool Spot was also on the Genesis. Typically when games are on both, I prefer to collect the Super Nintendo version versus the Genesis version, but there are some games that have differences, which I'll talk about here. In the Cool Spot game, you're playing as Spot from the 7-Up franchise, and you're shooting bubbles, collecting other spots, basic platforming stuff that way. Next up, we've got Hook, which of course is in the Peter Pan universe. You can fly around in this game, but it's limited based on collecting like pixie dust, so it's fun that way. That game's also on the Genesis, but on the Genesis version you have fewer levels, so a good reason to get it on the Super Nintendo instead of the Genesis that way. Next up we got B.O.B. or Bob. In this game you play through as a robot who is going on a date and he crashes his spaceship, so you're going through and trying to get back to your date on time and collect all your parts to fix your spaceship and stuff. The levels are timed, which I've mentioned I don't like as much, but it's still a fun game going through. There's lots of different weapons to get. You have limited ammo, so there's a challenge that way to conserve ammo. Next up we got Aladdin. This game is very famous for being incredibly different on the Genesis version. In the Genesis version, you have a sword. There's no weapon like that in this game. You're throwing apples at enemies to confuse them and stuff like that. Very different games that way. In this one, there's some magic carpet levels on the Super Nintendo version, but very, very different games between that and the Genesis. Next up, we got Tiny Toon Adventures, Buster Bust Loose. This game has a similar title on the Genesis, but it's a completely different name. So they're different games, but they're similar in nature. On the Super Nintendo version, though, you're playing through as Buster. I think my favorite thing about this game, though, is one of the enemies is Duck Vader, so that's really cool that way. Jumping out of the platform genre, finally, got it through all my platformers. We've got some shooter-type games. So we've got, first up, Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Zombies Ate My Neighbors are going through and you're trying to save all the people that are around. You get points for that. You can collect different weapons, and you progressively go through, and the game gets harder and harder that way. It's an arcade port, so it's got that style. Next up, we got Soldiers of Fortune. Soldiers of Fortune had a different name in other regions. I forget what it is, but essentially it's another top-down shooter. You're going through. There's 2 players. The different players have different abilities. So as you go through that way, your point is just to survive and find the exit. You can also, like I said, use those different mercenaries to get different abilities. So it has some replayability on how you want to play through. Next up is a licensed title, True Lies, Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Very fun game. Again, you're going through as a shooter, except in this one, you can't just shoot everything. You can't kill the civilians. So you got to be careful on what you shoot that way. It was also on the Genesis. They are very similar. I forgot to mention that Zombies Ate My Neighbors was also on the Genesis. No real differences there. But like I said, I prefer the Super Nintendo versions for how I collect that way. Next up, we got Star Fox. I'm not a huge fan of the early Star Fox games on Super Nintendo and N64. They're cult classics, though. I talked about this on my N64 collection video. Dual barrel roll from the franchise is very iconic. This one, very impressive for the day with the Super FX chip. Next up, we got a different kind of shooter. Instead of a run and gun, a shmup, as they like to call them. This is Raidentrad. It's one of the few shooters I have nostalgia for. That in 1942, which I have on the Sega Saturn. But I didn't really get into a lot of shooters. So there's just a couple of them that I have nostalgia for, whether it's from playing at Pizza Hut as a kid or what have you. But just not my favorite genre, but still a lot of fun. Next up, we've got the light gun games. So this one is Super Scope 6. This actually contains, they're saying 6 games, but it's not 6 games. It's like 3 games with 2 versions. The most notable one on here is basically like a Tetris. So it's called Blastress, I think. and you're going through and you're shooting basically the Tetris blocks in that way. Kind of fun. Probably one of the better light gun games on the system, Metal Combat. Metal Combat's got a mech theme. It's actually a sequel to Battle Clash, which I didn't think was very good. I don't even own it. I watched a video on it and said not for me. Didn't get very well reviewed either. But in Metal Combat, you just have more features than in Battle Clash. I feel like Battle Clash had an idea and they just either didn't have time or didn't have the foresight to make as good of a game as they could, and then they fixed it all in Metal Combat. So it's essentially the definitive version of the series. Moving away from shooter games, we've got the classic Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. I have a very interesting past with this game, no pun intended. For me, I never could make it all the way through the game. So I've made it 3/4 of the way through, and I just got really frustrated with the where do I go, what do I do, getting lost. And so I stopped, and I've actually never finished the game, which is a tragedy. But someday I'll finish it. I'll have to do it with a guide or with someone helping me. But it kind of paved the way for this series. It's actually the first Zelda game I played in the timeline of release, at least. But I've never played the NES Zelda games or the Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons games that came before it. So I really didn't touch Zelda before this point in the timeline of releases. And they did a lot of things in this game. So you've still got the top-down perspective. You've got, I believe, the Master Sword was introduced for the first time in this game compared to the previous games. You've also got Spin Attack, Pegasus Boost. A lot of staples for the franchise were really introduced in Link to the Past. So I really had a ton of fun playing it, seeing how these mechanics got introduced. But like I said, it was just very difficult. Other thing that they did is diagonal walking, which sounds really crazy. But I believe in the NES games, you can't diagonally walk. So that was something new. And I think the other thing that is different is you're swinging your sword instead of stabbing all the time. So that's a newly introduced mechanic. So the Super Nintendo really did a lot for the franchise and gaming in general, but more specifically there. Next up, we got Kirby's Dream Course. This game is basically mini golf. It's really strange, but really fun. As you're going through, you're just basically trying to get Kirby into the goal. And as you go through, I think I played through and just avoided enemies. But as you go through, oh no, you have to defeat them. So as you're going through, the goal doesn't even open up until you defeat all the enemies. That's what it was. Next, as my shirt says, the original Mario Kart. So this Mario Kart game, kind of hard to go back to, but still fun. It's not bad. Like sometimes going back to games is not a great experience, but Mario Kart's still enjoyable to go back to. The Game Boy Advance game is very similar, also easy to go back to. But really the start of a giant franchise. Mario Kart Wii was incredibly popular, and of course, Mario Kart 8 and 8 Deluxe are incredibly popular that way. But of course, I would always play as Yoshi. I still do to this day. Always playing as Yoshi, of course, as my favorite character. Next up, we got F-Zero. I always loved F-Zero games. The N64 and GameCube ones are better for obvious reasons. But it's still fun to go back to this one for that Mode 7 style graphics. It's done very well. And not to mention amazing soundtracks. All the F-Zero games just have amazing soundtracks. Now into the more obscure titles. We've gotten through all the amazing bangers, if you will. But next up we got Pilot Wings. So Pilot Wings was another launch title. It's technically a flight sim, I guess you would say, but it's really just a tech demo. They did the same thing on the N64. That way, but if you really are into Pilot Wings, play the 3DS version. The 3DS version is called Pilot Wings Resort. It's a great game. I'd highly recommend it. But it's cool to see what the early Super Nintendo days were like through this tech demo, and it's not a bad game. It's still fun to play through. It's tough though, very tough. Next up, we got Tetris and Dr. Mario. This is just a remake of the NES games and bundled into one cartridge together. They also added a 2-player mode that way, so that's a little different. Of course, you didn't have that on the original games. Next up, we got Wario's Woods, another puzzle game. So this one, you're actually playing as Toad, which is unique, and Wario's the bad guy, and you're going through and completing puzzles and advancing that way. Next up, we have the first abuse of the Tetris title, at least in my collection as we're going through, Tetris Attack. Tetris Attack has a different name in Japan. I forget what it's called, but they don't use the Tetris moniker. I think nowadays they just call it Puzzle League. So like Pokemon Puzzle League on the N64 is the same style game with new mechanics. It's not a Tetris game, but Tetris was very popular, and they were basically abusing that brand to get sales. I'll put it bluntly that way. Next up, another Tetris game, Tetris 2. I actually have a lot of Tetris games because I have another upcoming video, which is about all the Tetris games. So capturing footage for those, playing through them, finding some gems that I didn't think I would like. Tetris 2 is kind of interesting. There's a game on the Game Boy called Tetris Blast, which I didn't like as much. Tetris 2, you basically got to clear bombs. So there'll be bombs on the screen. You got to make Tetris lines to blow up the bombs as you go through. And as soon as you clear the screen, you go to the next mode, which is different for me because in Tetris, I love marathon mode. So playing endlessly until it gets so fast you can't keep up, right? That's kind of what I prefer in a standard Tetris game. This next game is an abomination. It's Wordtris. Basically, you have to make 3-letter words as you're dropping letters down, and it's just not that fun. It's not. I wouldn't recommend it. And last but not least, one of the few good sports games from that generation that holds the test of time. Ken Griffey Jr. presents Major League Baseball. If you're interested in some more obscure sports titles like that, I recommend SNES Drunk. He does a couple videos where he just talks about actually good sports games from the Super Nintendo era. And any of these games, really, if you're interested in seeing some gameplay footage, getting a more in-depth review about the game, SNES Drunk is great for the Super Nintendo. So, in the comments section, tell me what are your favorites. Do you have some games that I should look into that I don't have? Hopefully they're not too expensive. And check out my other videos. I mentioned my N64 collection. I mentioned my favorites video where I go through every single favorite game of every console I own. And of course, for algorithm reasons, like and subscribe, all those good things. Get those impressions on the video. And lastly, if you're interested in checking out my streams, I've got Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on Twitch. Check out my socials tab on my YouTube page. And thanks for hanging out. See ya.